to another super amazing Vegas Pro tutorial. Today we're going to be showing you how to chroma key or drop somebody into a background from a green screen. The first thing you do is you get your green screen footage. This is just a person I found dancing on the internet. There's quite a few videos like this floating around. But I don't know if it's that high resolution, but we'll go ahead and work with it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to trim off these parts that I don't want, those parts there. So we get about maybe 10-15 second clip here. And the first thing that I notice about this clip is I always like to look at the properties. So we see it's shot at 30 frames per second. So it's good to know. And the first thing I'm going to do here is I see a watermark here, which kind of bothers me, and I don't want that there. So if I'm going to go into Event, Pan Crop, the first thing I'm going to do is make sure I'm in the first position by clicking down here. And then I click Mask, and I'm going to go to this rectangle tool, and I'm just going to draw a mask. This is actually known as a garbage mask or a garbage matte, M-A-T-T-E. The only thing about doing this is that if this person goes beyond the mask, they actually disappear. They'll go underneath it, which can actually be useful in an effect like you can do. But for this, we're just doing it to mask out these parts that we don't want. Now the next part of this effect is kind of involved. I actually thought this video was going to be pretty quick, but then as I started going through it, I realized, oh my gosh, there's quite a bit involved. So I'll try to go as fast as possible. Now when we're on here, you've got 5 effects that we want to do. So you just double click on them and they'll populate up here. So we'll double click chroma key, chroma blur, color balance. We're going to want white balance, double click. And the last one is color corrector. And they're in order that you're going to need them, possibly need them. And if you don't need one, then you can skip it. But this doesn't solve your problem, then this will solve your problem. And if this doesn't solve your problem, this should solve your problem. And this is our last resort. But what we're going to do now is just unclick all of these effects, including the chroma key. The reason for that is when we brought it in, it's already activated and it's got the blue, so it's already keyed out the blue color, which could potentially contaminate our color selection. So we want to just turn it off so it's not sampling anything. Then we're going to click on the color box here. We're going to pick the color picker here, and then we're just going to draw like a big square like that. And it's going to give us a value that should key out this screen and turn everything black. So once I activate the effect by clicking in the box, we've got our key. So if I had a background, if I drag this background down here, you can see now, you can see through to the background. But we're not going to bring the background in just right yet. We're going to bring in a black background. Even though this appears black, it's actually transparent. So we need an actual black background. And we need this to fully assess how good of a job we're doing with our key, because we're not done. So what you try to do is try to find an image here where it shows the person, a lot of the person, so we can see a lot of edges and see how we're doing. So this is a good part right there. So I'm just going to hit M to mark this location. So now what we're going to do is we're going to try to fine tune our mask and make sure we're getting an actual mask. It looks like we have a good mask here, but we don't. So what we're going to do now with the black background there is I'm going to click on this little box here that says show mask only, and you'll see how bad of a mask we have as soon as I click it. This is the mask, and it should be, actually this is the mask. This should be completely white, and as you notice, it's not white. So what we got to do to make it white is we're gonna play with these low and high threshold values. As we drag this down, this should be completely white, and you notice as I drag it down, it gets wider and wider. And actually, if I keep going, you'll see it actually expands it a little bit. So what I would do is drag it down until it's completely white, and then maybe just a little bit further. Low threshold, if you notice we drag it, it kind of contracts it and actually makes it worse. But you never want to drag the low threshold beyond the high threshold. Usually that gives you a good result, but we may not want to push the mask down that far, so we can just back it off a little bit since it was looking okay. So now we seem to have a pretty good mask there, but do we? Do we? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to uncheck this. Now what I recommend you do is you hit this disk up here, save an image so we can look at it. Because it's the only way to really assess it is by printing out an image. So this is image 64, so let's take a closer look at this image. This also allows us to really zoom in. And so you'll notice here there's a little bit of green along the edges there. And there's some pixelation which is to be expected because this is a low res image. I mean, if you look, the whole image is pixelated, so why would the edges should also be a little pixelated? But there is a little bit of green there. So what we could do, we can do a couple things to try to get rid of that little bit of green that's there. And the one thing that we can do is go back in here, and if we click on chroma blur, we're just going to go ahead, and we have some presets here. You can play with different ones, but I'm just going to set the maximum because this is a very subtle effect, but it is used to help smooth out masks. So we've applied the chroma blur. Now let's take a look, take another picture and see what that looks like. And this is image 65. Let's zoom in, and you'll notice now it's gone. And I would say actually that's looking like a pretty good mask. Now if you had gone in here and let's say you'd done the high-low threshold and you'd done the chroma blur and there was still some green there, then you would go back into your effects, and that's where you might use color balance. And here you might pull it toward the magenta, or so this is green. If you go this way would go against the green, so that might help get rid of some green if you had green, but we don't. So just with the chroma key and the chroma blur, we've got a good mask. So we're good in that department, and we don't need color balance. And as a matter of fact, I can just delete this from the chain because we don't need it. Now once we've got our mask selected, we can move this black thing out of the way and bring in our background. And there's our person. So again, let me put her where she's in a good position. Now the first thing you'll notice is she's way too big for the scene. So what we're going to do for that is we're going to go to the first frame of our clip, which appears to be 3403, and we can check by hitting the arrow key, and that takes us off. So right here, this is our first frame right there. So as long as we're on the first frame, we go into track motion here, and then what we're going to do is we're just going to use this to resize her. Now try to imagine her standing there next to that post or pole, and then actually that's not a good position here for her. So let me do this. Let me go ahead, and we've got a keyframe set right there. So let's just drag this keyframe over here and put it there. And now with her standing, we can reposition her to a better location. So there you can see she's as tall as the street pole, so we want to resize her down by pushing in. And now maybe she's a little too small, so maybe make her a little bigger, maybe right there. And then we bring her here over here somewhere on the ground. Now as we're dragging her, we're creating this keyframe, but then there's this keyframe over here which is in a different position. You see that? Because it's affecting the whole track. So what we're going to do is we're going to delete this keyframe right here, because it's going to mess us up. And then we're just going to drag the one we just did and put it in the first position. And then she should be properly positioned right there. As a matter of fact, she looks a little small right there. So I'm going to go back into the track motion, and I'm going to make her a little bit bigger. Doesn't look right, quite right. See, and you'll notice as I'm readjusting her, I'm making another keyframe here because I made an adjustment. So what I need to do is get rid of this keyframe because that's our old keyframe, and now I can just move this to the front of the track, and now we've got a keyframe set, which I think she looks better at that position there. Okay, so now we've got her resized. Now the only thing left to do really is to match her more into the scene, because she doesn't really match the lighting. Now if you think about lighting, you've got exposure, which is basically the brightness of an image, and then you've got your white balance, which is basically colors being true to what they are. So in this case, she was obviously under different lighting than the background, and you can tell that's why it looks a little odd. So what we're going to do here, there's two effects we're going to use. So first we're going to go to white balance, and this is just on this clip here, just affecting this. So the first thing we can do is where it says select white color, we can kind of come here and find a little white and see where that puts us. So it does the slight adjustment when I go to that. And now the brightness, she looks a little too bright to me. So I'm just going to back off here on the brightness a little bit. Not too much, but she looks a little too bright for the scene still. So I'm going to pull her down to maybe somewhere right around there. It's a little too bright. Just a touch too bright. You can hit control and have a little bit finer control over your adjustments. There, I'd say that looks about right. And then with this adjustment, you can see it makes her more blue. So you can do this by just sight or trying to find a white color. But she looks a little, the scene to me looks a little bit blue, and she looks a little warm. So let me try selecting a white color again. How about this window back here? And see what that does. Okay, so I'm just going to be content with that for right now, but she still looks a little warm. One thing that we can do is if we hit Control-Alt-2, it pulls up our waveform monitor. Well, it pulls up our video scopes, and it's on RGB Parade. And you can see by looking at the scene in general that there's a lot of blue in here, and she only would represent a small part of that. So like here, this is her, the black that she's wearing. But you can see that the scene, to me, looks like it's got more blue in it. So what I'm going to do is go into color corrector, and I'm just going to pull everything a little bit toward the blue. Because sunlight, daylight like this, on broad daylight is more of a blue color. It's not yellow. She has a little bit yellow to her. So I think that pulls her into the scene a little bit more, kind of cools her off a little bit, and makes her match a little bit better. So you can try the white balance by adjusting the brightness and the amount of correction, and then you can also try the color corrector. And remember, like if there's too much red, you go against the color on the other side of the wheel, gets rid of red. And if you got too much green, if you could pull toward magenta, that gets rid of the green. If you got too much magenta, you pull toward the green. So the color on the opposite side of the wheel gets rid of that color. So now I think she's looking pretty good. Now there's one last thing we can do to try to blend her into the scene, and this is something that I think is awesome about Vegas Pro. So if you come into the #1 track here, and you click on compositing mode, and you go into custom, there is what's called layer dimensionality. We're going to click add and go OK. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go to shadow here. And basically what we're going to do is give her a drop shadow. So if I go into drop shadow, you can see it gives her a shadow, but it's totally wrong. So if we come down here to light location, if you look at the scene, it looks like the sun is kind of lower in the sky, but it's creating these shadows kind of over there. So I'm going to say that the light source is over here. And then as far as her shadow goes, if we play around with these values, what we can do is, like this value here, if you hit this slider, it backs up her shadow. But then if we come over here and we just play with the blur and the opacity, I think the height's off here, so I'm gonna pull our height back quite a bit here. Right there. And let me adjust the light source, because it doesn't seem, it should be more on the ground. So I'm just playing around with these settings here. So let me pull her back in a little bit more. So let me just adjust the blur, pull up the blur a little bit there, a little bit more. I got the blur all the way up, And I'll lighten that up maybe. I don't want to be too like obvious about it. So I still don't like the light source, so I'm gonna maybe put it like right about there. Like right there. Maybe right with that ledge. And you can play around with these settings. There's nothing right or wrong. But it just helps pull her into the scene a little bit more, because this shadow will move with her movements. And so that part's pretty awesome. And then when we're done, we're just going to draw a loop over this whole thing. And we're going to go to our settings here. And we want to make sure that we're set on 32-bit floating. We want to make sure that this is set to best. And we want to disable resample. That's mostly because we're at an odd frame rate there, and we don't want it Vegas doing anything too weird. That's it. And then we can go to File, Render As, and we're just going to do this HD 1080p. Then I'll show you what we ended up with. Before I end, I want to show you a couple things. The effect of the chroma blur is actually very subtle. So here is an image, one image with no chroma blur at all. And here is the chroma blur applied at the maximum setting. And as you can see, there's just a little bit of blurring here and some blurring there and a little bit of blurring here, but it's a very subtle effect. So the chroma blur is a good effect to add. It's very subtle and it stays to the edge, whereas if you use the blur on the chroma keyer, it actually blurs the whole image. So the chroma blur is preferable because it's just blurring along the edge and smoothing the mask. There was a question about the order of the effect. So we put the chroma key first and the chroma blur second. Some people suggest putting chroma blur first and chroma key second. But in the testing that I've done, it's better to do the chroma key first and the chroma blur second. If you look at these two images, this image was done with the chroma blur first, and you'll clearly see there's green fringing around, there's green along the edges here if you did the chroma blur first and then the chroma key. But if you do the chroma key first and the chroma blur second, I didn't see any green contamination along the edges. And actually with putting the chroma blur second, I actually didn't even see a need to use the color balance function. So I actually would recommend doing your chroma key first and your chroma blur second, not putting your chroma blur first. I think you should do the key first and the blur second. The key first and then any other adjustments second. So anyway, this is what you end up with.